Welcome to Off the Page. I'm Will Cain with Rich Vigilante and Andrew Redleaf. How's it going, guys?
Well, good.
Good. So listen, recently Andrew Cain, a Cato Institute scholar, wrote an article for National Review Online, and I've done an interview with him where he suggests we can solve our too big to fail problem, our bailout mentality problem, by limiting the size we allow the big banks to grow to. Essentially, if we have a too big to fail problem, then banks are too big to exist. Now, you guys have taken him to task on that. So I want to ask you, what's wrong with breaking up the banks? Wouldn't that solve our bailout mentality?
Who's to say what the right scale and scope and group of business activities that's right for a financial firm? I mean, you know, we would suggest that an informed market, given transparency and a level playing field, would most likely be the best decision maker.
Not only that, but in the course of U.S. history, the sudden disastrous failure of thousands of small banks has been just as dangerous and destructive as the sudden disastrous failure of a half a dozen huge banks, right? Thousands of banks failed during the Great Depression. Most of them were small, and the effect on the economy was devastating.
You're right, Andy. So the Great Depression's problem was a failure of many small banks. But what we looked at there was essentially a liquidity crisis, right? A problem that looks like we won't run into again, that we've learned our lessons there. So now it seems like our problem is allowing banks to get too big. So big, in fact, that we're scared they all...
No, it's not. It has nothing to do with the size. The problem is markets failed, right? Markets should work. So whenever markets fail, our first question should be why. Are markets likely to fail because the banks are too big? No, regulators may fail because the banks are too big, but that's not a reason for markets to fail. Markets failed because they were underinformed, which is the reason that markets usually fail. So let the Democrats solve, you know, if they imagine they can, let them come up with ways to regulate big banks successfully. We don't really think they can do it. We'd rather come up with ways for the market to regulate banks successfully.
And so there, Andy, there's the point of your article. You guys obviously feel there's a bailout problem, but your solution, Rich, is to increase transparency for the investors. Is that right?
You know, I mean, one problem is that it was possible, although with great difficulty, to separate good mortgage-backed securities from bad. They were incredibly complex. It was not easy to do, and it would have been nice to have more transparency there as well. But the problem with the banks was that even after one figured out which were the good mortgage securities and which were the bad, you didn't know which banks owned which. Right?
So, Andy, I wanted to ask you that. So doesn't the fact that some people, for example, John Paulson, not the least among them, could see the problem in the mortgage market suggest that there was plenty of transparency to project the problem?
Absolutely not. In fact, you know, I think one of the reasons that, you know, kind of our pounding on the idea of transparency and disclosure doesn't get a more, you know, enthusiastic endorsement from particularly the media is the media is misinformed as to just how bad disclosure is, and you know, you can read you know, Paulson's analysis or Ackman's analysis or Whitney Tilson's analysis on pieces that they published, and it's apparent that they're making lots of assumptions, and they're making guesses, and you know, they're drawing conclusions from what they don't know, what the institutions aren't disclosing, and then
right. And Paulson is actually a good example of our point. Paulson made a great deal of money, for which we cheer him, shorting mortgage-backed securities. He was not, in fact, shorting the banks, right? And he wasn't shorting the banks because he didn't know what the banks owned. Late in the game, some people did short the banks, but it ought to have been possible to see which banks were going off course and which banks were staying on the straight and narrow as early as late 2005. And if we had that information as early as late 2005, the banks that were making the worst loans would have had their money cut off. And since the worst loans were made from late 2005 through early 2007, an additional $2 trillion of bad loans that really crashed the system. Cutting those banks off in late 2005 would have averted the crisis.
Let me ask you this. If we grant that transparency is a problem, the key question seems to me here is increased transparency going to resolve the systemic risks that bank failures pose? In your article, you suggest that markets are psychotic, and I think that's absolutely true, that the value of securities rarely reflects the real-world value of companies. And you blame that risk on the lack of information, on the lack of transparency. But it seems to me that the argument could be made that you're not valuing the influence of bad judgment enough, that the same set of people could be given all a similar set of data, a similar set of facts, and arrive at different conclusions.
Well, yes, that could happen.
And many of those people are obviously going to be wrong. So what happens when bad judgment runs rampant?
So, well, we can't fix bad judgment legislatively, okay? So yes, it could happen. Everybody could be perfectly informed, and the world could still blow up. Nevertheless, if I have a bomb in my basement, I would rather have the manual that tells me how to disarm it than not have the manual, right? My odds are better if I have the manual. Will life be perfect after our solution? Of course not. Are markets better with less information than more? That's absurd.
Right. Right. So let me just ask you as a final question then. Would you see your transparency suggestion as a possible partnership idea with limiting the size of banks, or do you find that the idea of limiting the size of banks is simply draconian and unnecessary?
Well, and inconsistent with the notion of free markets, and inconsistent with the notion of an informed market being the principal systemic risk regulator, and not a handful of officials. I mean, one of the things.
But Rich, real quick, don't you guys suggest also that the banks aren't free market players anyways? We're not dealing with what is essentially a free market now.
That's true. Look, our position is let the regulators do whatever they want. It won't work. Okay, regulators want to decide the size of the bank. We're going to have some dysfunctional regulatory system anyway. Right. The exact shape of that dysfunctional regulatory system, whether it involves regulating the size of the banks, whether it involves a Grand Council of Regulatory poobahs, whether it involves all the regulators standing on one foot and spinning around in a circle and deciding how to regulate the banks that way, whatever the system they come up with, fine. We're not really interested. It won't work. What we think is you should let markets work. And to let markets work, you should give them more information. Whatever the regulators do, they're going to do. Who cares?
Okay. Listen, guys, I appreciate you enlightening me on this. Thanks for joining me.
All right, great.
You can find other interviews like this one at nationalreview.com. And follow me on Twitter at Will Cain, where you can see what interviews are coming up and submit questions. Thanks.